I hope everyone sees my screen well. And we are now going to start with the second session of the day related to genomic selection and its potential in organic breeding. My name is Michael Schneider. I work at FiBL, the Organic Research Institute in Switzerland. And we will go through this topic here step by step. So as you have seen already in the morning, there will be also another fifth module coming up by Friday, which deals with organic heterogeneous material, but today's session is mainly about these molecular methods. My plan for this session is to first give a general introduction. What could genomic prediction be used for and be useful for? This includes an introduction, and I also want to highlight a bit the mathematical background, which then goes on into the model fitting and the validation. We have seen this morning in the GWAS, for example, that there was a clear cutoff that would indicate to us if this marker would be useful or not. And in the genomic prediction, we need to go for other matrices to figure out whether our approach is valid or not. After this, I would like to give every one of you outlooks on how this could be hands-on performed by applying some programming examples in the environment of the R programming language. And this is then finalized by a small recap, and we also have a small exercise in the end, which would be important for those of you who are looking for the certificate to receive this one. But don't worry, even if you don't have any experience in programming, I'm pretty sure you can handle this. So we are going to start with the aims of the breeders and also the scientists. What we want to do is we want to make predictions of a phenotype, a trait, prior we measure it. So for example, a milk quantity of a cattle, or would be more interesting for us, plant health status, for example, in a new environment, or the seed yield. And all of these traits that I'm showcasing here are called complex traits because multiple genes just contribute to this phenotype to come in place. And one way to gain this information before we can actually measure it is by calculating the best linear unbiased prediction for this individual. We can utilize information, and we need to utilize information coming from other genotypes to calculate, to infer this information. For example, by using the pedigree information. So how related is this genotype of interest to other genotypes we already have performed some measurements on? Therefore, we have to test many of these related genotypes in multiple environments and also by multiple replications. And this information usually is summarized in the estimated breeding value. And this usually is expressed as an average score, which would be, for example, a plant height of 100 centimeters plus 10 centimeters for the given genotype. So that we would say the average of the entire population is 100 centimeters, and our genotype of interest is 10 centimeters higher or 10% higher than the average. And we can do this for every kind of trait you could think of. This estimated breeding value has some limitations because using only this pedigree information, that individuals are related by a certain degree. This mustn't be necessarily correct, especially in terms of recombination. And also when the variance of the parents is quite high, then the prediction error will also be pretty high. Elsewise, these individuals we are going to predict also need to be related to a genotype panel that we have phenotyped before. And as I explained before, we have to do a lot of phenotyping. So this estimated breeding value originally came from the animal breeding science, because usually these animals are much more valuable than our single plants from the plant breeding side. And they have heavily used this approach, but it came always with some limitations, as I explained here, especially when the variation is very high. And with this comes then the idea, then when we add or replace this pedigree information, for example, with the genomic data, we can include a marker based breeding value or genomic breeding value. And I've included here one figure which indicates here the correlation score of our actually measured phenotype to the predicted one using this breeding value and the genomic enabled breeding value. And we usually see a quite big advantage of these genomic approaches. So we are coming back to this complex traits because we want to need to know a bit more about this. So this complex trait has all traits the sum of the genotype and the environment that form the phenotype. And this variance of the phenotype is determined by multiple genetic loci. And not all of these loci have the identical effect size. So you can imagine that you're seeing here this picture, you see differently sized plants here, and there are many different loci attributing or affecting the plant height. But some of these genes might have rather small effects and others might have rather big effects, like these ones you can see here in this genome-wide association study. The big effects we can figure out. They are sitting above this threshold line, and we can say, okay, all these have a major effect on our plant height phenotype. But when we are calculating the sum of squares of our models, and with this, the explained variance, we usually see that maybe, for really good GWAS studies, we end up with 40 to 50% of explained variance from these markers. But the remaining part is unexplained. And usually this remaining part also comes partly from the experimental design, but also from other genomic loci and the genes that are associated with these that have smaller effects. And these smaller effects we cannot always measure with such a GWAS approach. And these effects can be kind of infinitely small. Besides that, we also have many genes that have no effect at all. So we have these kind of three classes: major effect genes, minor effect genes. Maybe you can imagine that these are sitting in between these lines, and there are genes that have actually no effect at all on our phenotype of interest. So why does it matter to us? With this, I also want to make advertisement for the third session coming up, which is the marker assistant selection part. But I want to highlight here one aspect that might be critical for these very complex traits, like for example the yield or the plant height. In our typical breeding scheme, we are performing the screening and then the selection of our plants. And in our marker assistant selection, we could make use of this genomic information, for example, from the GWAS that we collected, and then select some genotypes. This works very nicely for traits that are affected by very few loci. For example, a resistance gene for a disease. But for complex traits, it's not extremely useful in a way that we are performing a GWAS and then picking the markers coming from here. So one approach could be, of course, that we are going to improve our GWAS, that we are trying to also find smaller effects. And I included one example in here, which shows this really nicely. We see here a study on human height. And in this study, there were about 250,000 individuals tested. So an extraordinary big panel, yeah, not imaginable for us in the plant breeding part, I would say. And for them, they found about 700 of these QTL loci. The interesting aspect in here is that the explained variance was still pretty low. So it was not close to 100%, but it was more close to 10% actually. So we didn't get really much further. So what can we take from here? This marker assistant selection, yeah, falls short in especially the background of complex traits, where the phenotypes is determined by hundreds of thousands of genes with very small effects. And only few genes contribute more, usually more than 1% of this genetic variation for any of these complex traits. In here, I want to showcase these two approaches. The one we heard already this morning before about genome-wise association studies, or the QTL mapping, which is here related on plants that are highly related to each other, and here on a global panel. Here we find few loci with big effects. And in the genomic prediction, we assume, contrasting to this, that all loci have an effect on the phenotype. So it's kind of the opposite what we are kind of expecting, or putting as a starting point. So we use all the markers that we have and assign a value to them, an effect value. And in here, we need kind of many markers to perform the estimation, the prediction of our phenotype. And here we end up with just very few markers. So in here, I showcased an effect size diagram in here, where you see something similar like here with the p-value for all the markers, just indicating here these markers having a relatively small effect. Some have a bigger effect, but others just have a small effect. So one message I want to drop here is that this genomic prediction can be already seen as an alternative approach to boost this marker assistant selection. And with this also boost the breeding success of your breeding strategies. And we will see how to implement this in the future, and also how we could make this more accessible also for small breeders. Before we are coming to this point, I want to give here now the biological and also the mathematical background, just to make this a bit more understandable what is happening here. Because genomic prediction, this is a known term, but there are multiple mathematical assumptions or ways to predict this, and I want to showcase some of them, and in one of them I want to dive a bit deeper so that you can understand the actual procedure in here. So we are all starting with our reference population. So we have a number of genotypes. Let's say we have 200 genotypes. And for these, we have a trait that we are that to measure. For example, the plant height. We have the markers of these genotypes, and we have this given phenotype, which is our y-axis, or our y variable, and these markers information of the genotypes are given in here. So this might be 10,000 markers, for example. And in our genomic prediction approach, we estimate a marker effect A for each of these markers, for each genotype. This we multiply to each other and add the average across the entire population plus an error term to get a phenotype score. And this is possible also with a Bayesian model, but also classical linear models, which we are going to see closely. And in the end, we are getting this genotypes information by taking this estimate for each of these markers and receive this breeding score, breeding value for each of these genotypes. So to showcase this a bit more in a picture, so we have this breeding score, this breeding value U for a given genotype, which is this marker information, so the entirety of this marker matrix, so all for example, single nucleotide polymorphism markers that we have available times the marker effect, giving us this information, U, the breeding value. So now we are coming to a small excursion in the mathematical background, because we have kind of some problems in here. You have to imagine that we have many of these markers. So in this particular case, or in very many cases, you will use single nucleotide polymorphisms because they are the cheapest and easiest available and the most abundant on the genome. But you have few phenotype measurements, so genotypes, and this causes a massive problem. Why is this a problem? Our model will be rank deficient for two specific reasons. The one is that we have many SNP markers, and we technically have no clue about these SNP markers and how important they actually are. When you're checking out this expression here, where we want to express the size as a function of the weight and the age, giving a slope, so our marker effect, so-called here, and this is the average here. We might know as a human, okay, the size of a person might more depend on the age than on the weight, especially when these are children. But when these are two markers, let's say on even distinct chromosomes, we can't really say, okay, this marker is better than this marker. And this becomes a particular problem when these two markers here are collinear to each other. So, for example, when we would say the weight is itself a function of 2 times the age, then these are collinear to each other, and the linear model performing this analysis here doesn't really know which one of these to pick as a better or more true variable. So this is a real big problem for us, because the model will, as a linear model, automatically choose one of these as more important, then the other one will fall down. And the other aspect, which is also a big problem for us, is showcased here by these dots and this plain area in here. We have two observations here, but we technically have a three-dimensional plot. So when we would just want to solve the size by, for example, the weight, and we have these two plots, we could make a linear line through this here, calculate the least square sum to optimize this curve, and then we could make a prediction, okay, when the weight increases and also the size will increase. But when we now have another predictor value with this age and weight, we are in a three-dimensional room, and this line we previously had now becomes a plane. And now we have a serious issue, because we don't know what is the orientation of this plane in here. So in the end, we have too few measurements in here to solve this problem here, because when we would add another measurement in here, a third measurement, then it would be really easy to solve this issue, because now we know the orientation of our plane, and then we can put or estimate what is the size sitting in here. And now you could imagine we don't have just these two kind of markers, SNPs in our test set, but we have maybe like 4,000 markers indicated in here, and we just have 222 genotypes. So we have like 222 of these dots in here, but we have 4,000 x-axis and this one y-axis for our size. So we have a serious problem aligning this area here in our plot. And there were some smart decisions made or ideas coming up how to solve this kind of problem here. As we have seen, using a simple linear model will not work. In such a linear model, all these marker effects would be a fixed effect, and this doesn't really work. But what does work is when we transform such a linear model into, for example, a mixed model where all of these SNP effects would be treated as a random effect, because every random effect would undergo a so-called shrinkage effect, where the effect of each of these markers effects would be reduced, and with this also the variance and the error it is causing. We will come to this in a moment later, but beside that, I want to highlight that there is also another approach doing this, and this is calculating the genetic distance between the genotypes from the markers. So before entering the model, you are ending up with a matrix of these, as I said, these 220 genotypes with a matrix of 220 by 220, where we get the information how related each of these genotypes is to the other. This is what I also have showcased in here before. You have seen this figure here before. This is called a G-blob, genomic blob. So now we are coming back to this problem and how we could solve it. We can solve this either with prior information. This would be a Bayesian way, or a shrinkage. And this is what I want to explain here a bit more in detail. And these are the most commonly used shrinkage methods, also in machine learning. There's the ridge, the lasso, and the elastic net. And this one here is showcasing an example for the ridge regression. And if you want to learn more about this, I would highly recommend to check out this YouTube channel here, because it's really nicely illustrating these kinds of information. So what kind of problem do we have here? So I have said when we have 4,000 markers, we have kind of 4,000 x-axis and this one y-axis. So when we bring it down to a point which we can actually see by eyes, then it would look something like we have this one measurement here, and all of these here are kind of unknown. So we need to draw a line through one point, which typically is, of course, a problem. When we have 2 points, then this line would go through these 2 points. Our sum of square is 0. So the sum of square is the distance here to these dots. Would be kind of an optimal fit. But it could be also related to all these other points, a misfit, an overfit, an underfit. So in this ridge regression, what we do is we use the sum of square residuals, these dotted points from the red points, and all you can see in here, and then we add a penalty term in here. So you can imagine this here is our training data set, and this here is our testing data set. What this ridge regression penalty means here, that we have a lambda, which is arbitrarily chosen, usually by the model using cross validations and burn-in steps, and we have a slope. So as higher the slope gets, which you could imagine, sorry, so going steep like this here, as higher this penalty will be, and this will be then added to the square of sums, and then result in a pretty bad score. So this means as flatter this curve will get, as lower this penalty is becoming. And this technically means that the sensitivity of our marker effect will decline through this penalty in our model curve here. So that we, for example, say with 2 effects of the weight, there's just a half increase of the size, instead of with 1 effect of the weight, we have 2 increases of the size. And with this, we are reducing the variance of the marker, and with this also the error of this single marker. And we're doing this for all, for example, for all these 4,000 markers. Yeah, as I've showcased, there are different shrinkage approaches, which all aim to reduce this error of our linear regression, of our mathematical problem. Where we see here, we have this ridge regression where we have the slope squared. An alternative is this lasso approach, so the least absolute shrinkage and selection operator, where we see that the formula is a bit different to the ridge regression. What are the differences here to the ridge regression? This lasso regression can shrink the slope of these of this linear regression we have seen before, all the way to 0. And the ridge regression doesn't do this. So in here, it will always just get close to 0, but not 0. And in here, we can get all the way to 0. And this is quite relevant for us, for the marker effect, but because you can imagine, in this particular scenario, we can say, okay, there are useless markers in here that don't contribute any information at all. And in the rich regression, we still have to say, okay, but this marker or this, let's say this gene is part of the entire system, this plant, individual, this living organism, so it must somehow still have a small effect on our target variable, even when it's completely different from its physiological background. And this elastic net in the end is a combination of both this lasso and ridge regression. So some markers still can go to zero, but it's assuming that this should usually not be the case. So beside that, we also have these Bayesian approaches, and I don't want to go too deep into this because I think I've bothered you with the shrinkage methods now enough. The only thing we want to keep in mind in here is that contrasting to these shrinkage methods we have seen is that each marker in these Bayesian approaches has a different prior variance. And in the ridge regression, all markers have an equal variance. So we're coming back to this practical application. And I just highlighted here some approaches to calculate the genomic prediction that exist. So the first one I mentioned before, this genomic relationship-based method called GBLUB, where we just calculate kind of the kinship prior our estimation and use this kinship information to then afterward do the estimation. And then there are some marker-based methods, sometimes also called SMP blobs, where we have this ridge regression blob, but also different Bayesian approaches. So I want to highlight this here a bit more in detail so that you can understand this a bit more in detail to make in the future a better your own choice which model might be the best suited for you. So as I said, we are calculating at the beginning the identity, how identical these genotypes are by state. We also quantify the number of the alleles that are shared between the two individuals. So we always do a pairwise comparison and then store it in this matrix of this n by n dimensions. So each genotype is compared to the other genotypes. And we can technically do this not only for the additive relationship, but also for the dominance or the epistasy effects. Usually these get more difficult and I would also say error prone to predict correctly as further down you go. And for inbreeding, selfing genotypes or mainly selfing species, like for example barley or wheat, the additive genomic matrix is usually sufficient to calculate these genomic blobs. And as I said, we don't use the SNP effects, but we use the genomic breeding value straight away to calculate the phenotype or predict the phenotype. The other thing was the ridge regression blob. In here we use the all the SNPs available, and we have then our marker matrix Z times the allele effect A, which then gives us our genotype effect. similar to the G-blob as before. And relevant for us is also that these marker effects follow a normal distribution a priori. So this is always important for these kind of models, that they assume a certain distribution of these effects, where we can see that the majority here is close to zero, and then it declines to very big effects, negative or positive. And all of these markers have the same variance, while in this Bayesian approach, each marker has its own variance. Yeah, and as I said before, we have different of these Bayesian approaches available. So we have all SNPs that have an effect on the trait in this Bayes A approach, where few have a large effect and where most have a small effect, similar to the ridge regression. And in this Bayes B approach, we are more or less assuming that many QTLs are affecting the traits, but we also have a quite big portion of SNPs which have no effect, which would look something like this here. This is the distribution that is lying underneath this Bayes B approach. So yeah, you could imagine of a trait, for example, an resistance trait to a pathogen that is modulated by maybe 20 genes on the genome, but not more. Then this Bayesian B approach would be a better fit, because the distribution here matches our expectations much better than, for example, this one here. And this Bayes C is a combination of the ridge regression blob and the Bayes B. So it combines this distribution of the ridge regression blob, and assumes additionally that some of these SNPs have technically no effect. And similarly, this Bayesian lasso performs as well. So now you might wonder, okay, we have seen so many different options here now. I thought, okay, genomic prediction, you do it like GWAS, you get a result, that's fine. So how do I now choose which one is the one that I should choose? And there was one publication comparing these different approaches here for two different traits. And the quintessence from here coming is that it always depends on the trait. So you as a breeder, as a biologist, as a scientist, have to make a prior assumption what would be more suitable for it. You see, there are some traits where it doesn't make any difference at all. But other traits where, for example, this Bayes C or Bayes B models perform much better than, for example, the ridge regression models, for example. I don't want to leave you now here with an "it depends" statement. I want to highlight that this thing here is much more common, this trait 1, than this trait 2 example. So more or less for maybe like 70 to 80% of all the traits you are interested in, it will be looking more or less like this, that one or the other model is 1 to 2% better. But that shouldn't really affect your predictions in a such major way that you're making mistakes in your, for example, marker or genomic selection assisted selection in the breeding schemes. The thing you can keep in mind that this estimated breeding value only coming from the pedigree and the phenotypic information usually performs much worse than our genomic enabled breeding values. One last question that might come up to you as well would be, why don't we use machine learning to predict these phenotypes? We are now in the age of machine learning and everything seemed to be possible with this. There are some research groups out there that already tried this, and the problem so far has always been that training these machine learning models never turned out into substantially better estimates compared to these classical approaches of, for example, ridge regression or lasso or the Bayesian approaches. So this usually you find rarely outputs like showcased down in here where this outperforms. So at the moment you're pretty well when you're going with these standard models. Now we are coming to a point where we want to know how the performance of this prediction models is assessed, because so far you have just seen how it's calculated and what we had to keep in mind and why things don't work, and you have technically not seen some numbers. And now I want to dive into this aspect here and want to highlight at first the validation procedure, how we get this information, because it's not as simple as in the GWAS that we are picking these ones with a very low p-value. We technically don't have p-values. We have a marker effect, which is rather big or low, but we have heard, okay, depending on our assumptions we make, all of these marker effects matter, or let's say all of these marker effects have an impact. So to generate a matrix or an information from this, we use kind of a Pearson correlation to predict in a validation test set how well our model performed. So that you imagine we have this linear line that we have seen in these plots, and then we are taking the information from this linear line about our phenotype of plant height. So that we are saying, okay, this phenotype from genotype X, Y, Z is of plant height 120, and this is our predicted score, and our true score is 115, for example. And we do this in our validation set for a bigger number of genotypes, so that we can calculate a correlation across these genotypes. For example, that you have 50 genotypes in this validation set, and then in these other 4 groups you have 200 genotypes where you train your model and then you test it on this validation set to get this Pearson correlation. And you usually don't do this one thing at a time, but you do this multiple times, that every part of your training data once is also a validation data. And this is quite important to access the accuracy of our data, not only in this small subject, but across a bigger set, because we have 2 distinct problems that we have to balance and have to create a trade-off. The one thing is a bias. So a bias is generally when we want to target this area here, that we are missing our target area quite by a margin. And the other point that is relevant for us is the variance. So the error that occurs in terms of the sensitivity in our training set. So this would mean here we have here an increased variance. And this is also not what we want. Yeah, we technically want to have no bias and a low variance. And usually we have to make sure that in our models we have this underfit, this bias, and this overfit with a high variance under control. And usually we have to make a trade-off between these because we can't achieve both of this. So in this particular example here, we could say that we are testing a phenotype, a trait like plant height on a set of 100 genotypes, maybe from Europe, something like that. And then we would end up with a model that is looking something like this, and then we apply it to some to another set of 100 genotypes from, for example, North America, which are kind of quite different, and we are quite off by a margin. So this is something that we really want to avoid. Similarly to this increased variance, where, for example, our test set has very low variance in our result, and we kind of need to extrapolate in our from our training to our testing set, and then get a quite obscure and high variance information in the end. So when we have a high variance or a high bias, we have to check what we have to do different. Maybe we have to choose a different model, but also maybe our training and testing sets are not very well balanced. We can also have this effect of high bias and low variance. So this can be then, as I explained before, that the training set has too small variation compared to the testing set. And for the others, you can have a look yourself. I don't need to read this out here. So in the end, we come to this summary here. How do you run a genomic prediction? So technically, you measure your phenotypes, for example, also in multiple environments, years, and experiments. Of course, more data is always better when they are well assessed. We are separating the genotypes and, for example, 10 or more groups for the cross-validation. But please keep in mind that you don't make the test set of your genotypes too small. And afterwards, then we perform the genomic prediction. We extract the marker effect from this model or the breeding value when we use the genomic plug model. And then we use these values with the mean of the population to predict the genotypes phenotype score. And now I want to come back to this one figure that we have used or that we have seen before, and you will get to know much more in the afternoon session. The question now might be how to integrate this, because you as a breeder might not be interested to pay like maybe 50 euro, maybe even just 10 euro for each of your F2 lines for genotyping them with 10,000 markers. So this might be just too costly for you and totally understandable. What we could actually do here is that we go kind of a step further and say, okay, many markers explain very little to nothing to the phenotype variation. And even when there's biological background associated to them having this very small effect, omitting these from the model would not be very costly. As I said, they have a very, very small effect. And there are two different approaches where we could say we are reducing from 10,000 markers maybe to just 100 markers. And this is a kind of feasible value, I would say, to include this also in your breeding schedules. One is a top-down, I call this top-down, and the other one is a down-up approach. So the top-down is something where you use all the markers in a starting setup, and you reduce the number of markers based on their effect. So the advantage is that you don't need to have any prior information on any QTLs. Maybe you just don't have this information on hand. But it's kind of an untargeted approach, yeah. So it's something like these machine learning approaches where some predictor variables are still taken into consideration and taken into account as a strong variable, even when they have rationally no meaning for our output variable. So this could be that we are selecting a marker that is totally far away on a different chromosome than the actual QTL or than the actual gene that would contribute to this particular phenotype, but it's still nicely correlated to it. And the other one, I call this up-down, is you start with a set of QTLs and then you gradually add markers to it until you have a sufficient precision reached. And there's a very nice tool published for this. It's called this GMS tool, which has a GitHub repository, which you can also visit. And as I said, the advantage is that it's pretty targeted, but you need to know these QTLs in advance, of course. So what we are going to look at today is this top-down approach. So you have seen this figure here before. We see here all these marker effects across. And when we make an arbitrary cutoff here, top and down, we exclude everything here that has a very small effect, and then we just pick these ones which has a rather big effect for our models. So I've listed all these additional information in here. And in the second part, we are going to have an outlook on how we could actually run these genomic predictions with different R packages. So all this code is available. And let me shortly stop my presentation. So we are on this particular website where here are all these relevant links to the documents. So in here you find the presentation I just gave. There is also a small handout that summarizes this information. And we are also having this information about the second part just right in here. There's also one link here for the homework where, I would kindly ask you if you are interested in having the certificate to click on this link here. You have a script and some assignments written down here that you can either answer. You don't have to answer all of these. You do one of these in here. This homework script has some left out areas in here with these dots where I would ask you to fill out this information. This might look a bit overwhelming, but don't worry. Technically, the only thing you have to do is that you download this HTML information from the website, from our genomic prediction workshop, and then follow the instructions in this tab here. So I would say if you have so far any questions, this would be kind of a good time point to ask questions. If you don't have any questions, then we can also proceed with the hand-on examples. If you don't have R or have never used R, then I'm pretty sure you still can do the homework, because let me quickly go back to the homework and show this to you. Here is a script. For example, in this particular case, this is the function to perform a genomic prediction model. And I left out here some information that has to be included in here. And you don't have to run this code to test it, of course. I'm very happy when you run this code and be successful and answer any of the other questions, like getting the correlation score. But going into this document here, scrolling down to the point where this particular function turns out to be seen again, like where is it? For example, here is it. Do you see? Okay, that indicates this one here is related to train equals geno. Okay, this must be then the genotype information I have to include in here. The genotype information is named like this here, so probably I have to include this z equals geno in here. And we have this further down here as well. And one additional request up here to subset our phenotype with just 80 genotypes. This is kind of a helping advice for you when you want to run this, that this model might run pretty long on your computer, on your laptop when you don't do that. So I see no further questions, so we are just going into the hands-on example. As I said, you can do this also on your own later on. This data is available, and we have these 3 different R packages available as an example to perform the genomic prediction. And I also included one tab for this marker selection. And I would like to go through at least the data preparation, the R block, because it's also related to the homework, and to the marker selection. And we will see if we can also manage to go through this here. Everything should be also self-explanatory, because there's always some text explaining what is going on in here. So anytime in the future, you should be able to come back here and kind of repeat what we have done here. So let's get into this data. And I've seen from the first session that there were already some people asking, okay, how can I actually know what kind of shape this genotype file, for example, has to be? And of course, this is usually the biggest burden doing this programming. So I've highlighted what we have, for example, here as an input file. We have our genomic position in here, and we have our genotypes. In this example, we just have 23 genotypes, so a small data set, and we have here this information of the alleles for each of these markers given for each genotype. So what we always need to do in these mathematical approaches, and we don't have kind of a helping hand in here, is that we have to translate this code into integers like 0 and 1. And these packages we are going to use usually work with -1, 0, and 1. So that you have here this homozygote reference allele, heterozygote, and homozygote alternative allele. And this usually is also quite helpful to keep this order in place. from this table up on top here, we don't really see what is the reference allele and what is the alternative allele. So I have here one small box which gets us the information which is the major allele, and this is what we set as a reference allele. So the majority of alleles, like for example for this one here, we could assume that it is the GG. So the G is the reference allele and C is then the alternative allele. And we then calculate this and assign then the scores of -1 and 1 to the respective allele. So that 1 is the reference allele and -1 is the alternative allele. Yeah, and this is what we do with this chunk of code, where we now have prepared this data set quite nicely. So the next thing is that we load our phenotype data. In this particular case, I'm also having collected phenotype data across multiple days in 2 different environments, 16-hour light and 8-hour light for these 23 genotypes we have seen before. And we have 2 target information phenotypes, which is plant height and the relative chlorophyll content, which have this kind of range. So the plant height ranges from 7 centimeters to 46 centimeters, and the chlorophyll content from 29 to 56. So the variation in our data sets is already quite good. So we could assume that, yeah, based on this, we could end up with some good estimations with low bias. So now we're going here into this R blob, which the name already indicates it's performing a rich regression blob, but it's also possible to run a G blob, so a genomic blob. And when we are checking on the information from this mixed model solver for genomic prediction, the core function in here is this mix.solve, where we have our phenotype, which we have to provide in here. We have our so-called design matrix of random effects, as I have indicated in the presentation before, and these are our markers. We could potentially also use here covariance matrix, and this, the K, as the K already could be interpreted, is our kinship matrix. So we use this kind of information for our genomic blob. And in the end, we also have an additional design matrix for fixed effects. And this could be, in our case, quite useful, as we have, for example, different environments at different dates. As you have seen here previously, we have different environments and dates. And for example, we could use these as additional fixed effects in our model to help it a bit with the information. Because of course, on the last day of our observation, for example, the chlorophyll content will be much higher than on the first day, similar the plant height. And also with 16 hours light, the plants tend to be bigger on the last day than on the first day. So we have many informations given in here, and also what we have here is the information about the output information. We have our marker effect, even in here, the beta, which is the average across the entire population, and these are quite important figures we have to extract from our model later on to predict then our scores. As always, you will find a small running example in here to get familiar with this function. Yeah, but we are going to show this example now for our own data here. I selected here now the relative chlorophyll content, and in this very first example, I'm just doing it for one date and one environment to start things off easily. One major thing that we have to keep in mind is that we have to make sure that the genotypes in the data sets are in the exact same order, because this program will not perform any checks on this. It will just assume that it is, and by accident, when you don't have it, have a good correlation, use this in your work later on, and after a year or so, if you figure out, okay, this is all based on wrong assumptions, this wouldn't be very helpful at all. Yeah, so we have to make sure that this information, where we check that the row names of our genotype file is equal to the phenotype genotype information, which is in this case is still false, but when we reorder the genotype file and check again, then it's true in this particular case. So we always have to make sure the order is correct. Then we just pick our phenotype here, as I said, for the 16-hour environment and for one date, for the two traits, I don't remember fully what is in here, but I think the trait is in here. And now we perform here a genomic prediction score, which requires for our GBLUP model one additional step, and this is that we calculate this additive matrix here in front of it, which is then the kinship matrix. So you see, the output of this function actually here is this, I call this G2, which is then the relativeness. And the maximum usually should be like 2. In this output, you see this mathematical procedures in the background don't always line up here to exactly 2, but to a slightly different score. So this is a kind of indication that these are just approximations, and the other programs, the other R packages like this summer package or this BG LR3, they offer also approaches to calculate the genomic BLUP, the kinship, but with slight different algorithms, and therefore the result can also be a bit different. So we're having this information now here in our G2, actually here in this A, the additive matrix. So we run our GBLUP model by just this small function in here, and the respective rich regression BLUP we perform here on our Z matrix with all random effects on the markers here. And what do we get from here? We have once this beta score. So this is the average chlorophyll content across all genotypes. And then we have this U, so our marker effect, for each of these markers. So you see some have a very small positive effect, but others have for example, a small negative effect. But what all of these have in common is that these effects are really, really small. And we have seen this before, why it is like this. So to get now to where we want to make a kind of prediction, okay, how good is this? We need to get this score, this marker score here, and store it somewhere. We need our genotype table, our -1 and 1, and we have to do a matrix multiplication with our marker effect to get the best unbiased prediction for these genotypes. And then we add this average across all genotypes plus the score of the BLUP. And this is technically then the score across all these markers summed up together. And finally, we can do this Pearson correlation of our true score to our estimated score. And we can see that the score here is really, really high. And the prediction across the line is kind of perfect. This falls short in two aspects. Of course, we have no training and testing set. And the other thing is we have just done this now for 1 day and one environment. We can also check here once more with the gblob model. As you might remember, we created here this GB variable from the genomic blob. And when we access it, we get the blob right away for each genotype by the U factor here, and can then estimate again our chlorophyll content coming from the model and correlate it and also plot it. And it's looking kind of similar, so both have done the assignment pretty well, I would say. So we have used in this particular case about 21,000 markers and a matrix for the genomic blob of 20 times 23 times 23, and they both ended up in a pretty similar result. It's pretty nice, yeah. So we're now going one step further and doing this here now for the full model, I would call it, where we take also the days and the environments into account. What we have to do in this particular case in here is that we have to replicate the genotypes as often as we have days and environments. So 17 days times 2 environments makes 34, and then we replicate the genome file 34 times. This is just a necessity of this package. It's a bit annoying, but for the future now you have here this code where you can replicate it. We will order this again so that we have the right order in place. And one important aspect, again, we transformed the bases already into markers, and now we are also transforming here the environment and the time variables into numeric values so that the model can actually work and calculate with it. So this model here now already looks a bit more sophisticated because now we have also these fixed effects included in here. And we can again check for the results. So now we have not a single beta score, but 2 beta scores in here for our environment, like 16 hours and 8 hours. So 16 hours the reference, and the 8 hours is the deviation. So with 8 hours we have on average across all genotypes like 13 whatever chlorophyll content lower, and for each day we see an increase of 0.12 in the chlorophyll content across all genotypes. And again, we have here our marker effect stored under this hue. And just a reminder, we have here this environment and the phenotype information stored in here. And we can then calculate, similar to before, our estimated score of the chlorophyll content. This time, of course, we have to make sure that for the environment and the time, we do these calculations here separately and then include this into our equation as well, and then we perform here this correlation. Here's a plot related to this, so we see quite nice correlation still, quite linear. So this fit is quite good. Now we still have the one last thing that we don't have done, and this is the cross-validation. We have tested now this prediction on itself, on the data itself it was trained on, which is reasonably fine, but not our main purpose. We want to have this in the future, that we predict genotypes that we have no phenotype information on. So with this, we are splitting our data set into crossfolds. So in this particular case, I'm creating 10 crossfolds across our data set, and we'll also create a small data table where we can then store the information how well this correlation performs for each cross. So we are running a small loop here across all these 10 crossfolds, and we split here into a training and a testing data set according to this one here. Is it related to this number 1 to 10 or not? We do the similar thing for the genotypes and the phenotype data so that both are sitting in the same set, and then we just perform our genomic prediction approach here. So here again, I use the rich regression blob. We calculate again what we have seen before, our scores, and then we perform a correlation. Once for the training and one for the test set, and then we have in the end information across all these four changes here, where we see that we have a training correlation score, which is pretty much what we have seen above with 0.92, and we have a test set, which is very close to it and sometimes even higher than the training set. So I would say it's pretty good. Our model that we have created here can predict this very precisely, and our mean correlation across all is still pretty good. When we make now a plot of this, we can see that we have kind of a difference or two different groups in here, which is quite expected. One here is the 8-hour environment of light regime, and here is the 16-hour light regime. And now the question to you can obviously arise, okay, we see here this, and when we draw a straight line through this, then the correlation will be pretty good for sure, because we have a kind of gap in here. But what when we are more honest with us and calculate the correlation of this model, particularly only for the subgroups? So when we divide these groups here, and then correlate only this 8-hour environment and then the 16-hour environment. And there we see that the prediction in these groups here is a bit lower. So 0.65 we see down in here, so the correlation is still quite okay, but up top here it's 0.5. Usually expected quite okay, but we can clearly say the prediction in the 8-hour environment is much better than in the 16-hour environment. And especially up top here with this 50, we see kind of saturation. So this is not really extraordinary good. One last thing we could do is that we try to test if we can predict the last 3 days correctly from our model that we have chosen, so that we kind of use the last 3 days as a testing environment, that we say, okay, these 3 days here performed as a test set, and everything before performs as a training set. Same calculations as before. And we see that our test set here indicates quite nice correlation score. And even in here, we see that the correlation is pretty good. So technically, what we can say is yes, we can do that. We have to be a bit careful with these two groups here, because in here the correlation is much better than in here. So we can say that we can predict this score better in the 8-hour environment than in the 16-hour environment. And the biological background in here could be just that we have not enough variation up top in here because we are kind of too late. But we actually have good variance in here across our time points and also genotypes. Maybe just because we are not very late in our predictions. So one thing I want to showcase in here is we have this BGLR model, which is the Bayesian generalized linear regression model. We have many options in here to perform genomic predictions. We have multiple models that we can choose from. The one I've shown before, you can use technically the ridge regression and the genomic blob model. And in here you have many more models available. It is a bit more difficult as a beginner to get started with, because as you can already see down in here, we have to define our model quite specifically, and it's it takes a bit more time to get into this. Nevertheless, maybe as a home assignment or for your future approaches to start your breeding programs, I've written down here a small function that summarizes all these necessary steps to perform to run a genomic prediction, including these correlations. And down in here, you technically run this function, this test, a genomic prediction, where you then define your model. In this particular case, we see that we have again here our matrix of our environmental scores, so 8-hour, 16-hour light regime and the days, and the type of trait it is. These are the fixed effects. And then we add some random effects. For example, here's this Bayesian B model, a ridge regression model, Bayesian lasso model, Bayes C model, Bayes A model. So as I said, this has more models to offer. We can run all of these here, these models, and then in the end compare the output of these predictability across these 10 crossfolds we have seen here before. And just alike what we have seen before, we have some models that perform kind of equal to each other, and then one model that performs a bit worse. And when you remember this Bayes C model, that's a combination of the ridge regression and the Bayes B model. So in this particular case, it seems that this combination of both is not doing fair justice here. And we can also see that these ridge regression blobs tend to have a smaller variation compared to these Bayesian approaches in here. Right, so we have kind of maybe 2-3 minutes left where I want to dive into this last aspect, which is the marker selection approach. This here is a small outline of this GMS tool, but you find much more information on the respective GitHub site. The information I want to highlight here is from this other approach where you have no previous QTLs available. So what we are technically doing is we run our genomic prediction model as we have seen it before, and I use again this RBLUP tool because it's easier to visualize here. with our full data set, with the light regime and the days included in here. We calculate then the marker effects, and then we calculate the actual correlation scores for the 16-hour and the 8-hour separately, calculate then the average for this, and this is then our baseline. So on average, the correlation scores for these is 0.661. This is as good as we can get so far. So what the goal is now that we come at least close to this score here again, but use drastically less markers. We have here 20,000 markers. This will cost us a fortune for our breeding nursery to test. We can probably afford 200 markers to build a chip and then test this, but this is the maximum we get from our head of department. Not more money available. Okay, good. Then we are going to check now on the effect size of these markers. And we see many, many of these markers here scattered around here. And now a question to you. How many markers have an effect size of 0? I'm not going to answer this question. You will find the answer in this tab here of the summer package, or you already know from the presentation. Yeah, but all of these markers here end up with a Pearson correlation of 0.661. And now we make here a cutoff, top and bottom, and everything that lies in between here we drop. So that we end up with just 182 markers in the end. So this is now our new genotyping set. This falls under the threshold of our team leader saying 200 markers would be financially suitable to do. So now we are running the genomic prediction as we did before with the subset of markers. So we create here the subset. We use the subset for the genomic predictions. For simplicity, there's no cross-validations included in here, but we already have seen before that even without doing the cross-validations, the training to a testing set were quite close to each other. And then we end up here with a score of 0.661, which is technically identical to this full model. So we can say that picking this 182 markers is equally well than to this 2022 markers. We are still a bit confused, maybe, if this can be true. So we are just picking now. This 182 markers is a number 100 times, randomly 182 markers from the set, and perform the genomic prediction on these 182 markers again. And then we get out a summary score, how these perform across all of this. And then we can see that when we pick random markers in here, that our prediction ranged from almost nothing to about 0.55, which is still much worse than our selected approach up here. So this is actually pretty good news for us and our head of department, that with only 0.2% of the markers, we could reach up to the same prediction score that we had before. And now we're going to validate these in training and testing set, these 182 markers. We have seen this pipeline before, so I'm just scrolling down in here, and we're saying that it's stable across all these crossfold changes here, these 5 crossfolds that I'm picking here. So technically, we are now good to generate this smaller chip, this customized chip for us to implement this genomic prediction in our breeding to boost our breeding yeah, as I said, everything is available for you, and you can also, yeah, scroll through these other panels here if you like. Yeah, exactly. So now would be kind of the time if you have one or two or maybe more questions. I would request that you send this to me. So let me quickly also. If this is not the case, then I wish you a nice lunchtime. In any case, for future scenarios, when you have questions, feel free to reach out to me. The worst thing I can say to you is that I currently have no time to answer or support you with any questions. So yeah, feel free to reach out to me.